cultures of literacy, interesting enough, in this early modern and pre-modern period, medieval Islamic world generally, has not been studied. Just recently I saw one book that's out on Arabic literacy and orality that's come out for the medieval Baghdad and Cairo, and then something that I've thought but seen but I haven't been able to look at yet is Brian Spooner on the Persianate world as well, on literacy. So that's something that I think that I'm adding to the field, but really looking at it not from the positions of how institutions like the religious institution or the madrasa are producing knowledge and then passing and disseminating it, but in fact trying to see how people outside of sort of elite circles are able to, are literate, and what that literacy really means for them in this period in early modern Isfahan. And also, of course, I should mention that collecting practices, I think, are one of those places where we really don't think about how collecting does come to constitute not only selves, but also really create a sense of knowledge, right? I mean, what one puts together, the little fragments of pieces that one puts together throughout their lives, your own libraries, your own pieces of sort of material objects that you bring together, tell us or allow us at least some entry into people and what sort of constituted their minds and their sense of being and their knowledge. So in this book, I'm trying to chart out a civilizing process in early modern Isfahan, reliant on the production and dissemination of pedagogical manuals on proper etiquette, conduct, and manners, or adab, to regulate social behavior and emotional expression. And, you know, a civilizing process, I realize, is a problematic term to, in fact, use because it is so Eurocentric. But I'm using it really on purpose in order to enter into a dialogue with European historians of the early modern period. Norbert Elias famously coins the term for a study of Paris and Vienna in this period under Louis XV and Louis XIV in particular. And so he is more interested in the way in which the reach of a new center of authority in Paris and in Vienna through print culture is able to really come to control, or at least try to regulate certain kinds of ways, gestures, manners, behaviors. And so in Isfahan, what we'll be looking at today, I'm actually trying to look at the civilizing process before print culture through manuscript production and dissemination of manuscripts as well. So these manuals on adab created through literacy a cultural know-how that had to be studied and embodied by refined subjects of the city of Isfahan. To be in style, one spoke poetry and moved with the gestures set out in codes of adab or etiquette. Adab literacy, I argue, heightened practices of seeing, of reading, of writing, and of collecting. As Isfahanis came to cultivate adab, their distinct subjectivities and levels of literacy were shaped by these social practices. It is within this context that I will consider the disciplinary work, this civilizational or adabizing project performed on the medium of communicating selves and friendship. And I'll speak for around 40 minutes, but then I really want to open up because it's a process, a work in process, so I would really like to hear your responses to the paper and to the work. Okay. The ritual of disciplining seekers of knowledge, طالب ilm, as a method of initiation into fraternal communities is a common trope of representation in early modern Persian visual texts. Though generally depicted as a pedagogical practice within mosque and seminary settings, these images render an explicit hierarchy between master and disciple, where white and black bearded teachers pass on their knowledge through bodily chastisement, the most common mode of which is the bastinade. Inevitably, they draw up the complicity of empathetic, beardless brothers, who have in turn endured the very same physical pain. This 1650 signed drawing by the painter Muhammad Qasim captures the production and circulation of knowledge that binds communities of literacy together. This particular one is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Knowledge and discipline spring forth from the graying master, who holds a stick with which he is about to strike the bare soles of one of his students. He is the extension of the book and the inkwell that rests on a small wooden table in front of him. The master leans on a heavily stylized tree with large leaves, barg, that semantically and visually remind the viewer of sheets of paper, barg as well in Persian. Here, the painter tells the natural history of how trees were transformed to transmit knowledge from former masters, collected leaves bound up into a book, like the one on the table. Significantly, the tip of the master's stick points to Muhammad Qasim's signature. It's a very small little feint here that you can see. Muhammad Qasim writes himself into a genealogy of master painters. The story of knowledge and discipline does not end here, for its circulation involves the present in this process. Just like the master and the book, students are drawn out as vital to transmission. They are made to be participants in the pedagogy of punishment. Look at the fearful culprit. His feet are tied to a rod as his two fellow students hold him, balancing his weight with one hand on the ground and the other clasping the rod. A triangulation is created with the exchange of grimaces that connect three peers as they cultivate friendship. So I think that there's something going on here between these three grimaces that the painter is drawing in. The two students assisting the bastinada seem to hesitate in their compliance with the wishes of their master. Muhammad Qasim distinguishes the two fellow students in dress and in expression. The one wearing a cloud-designed cloak and a pencil around his belt appears concerned. He may be feeling empathy with the victim, perhaps wondering if his turn will be next. In contrast, his partner wears a distinctly plain white robe and seems to be enjoying the scene, taking pleasure in the anguish of his fellow brother as he awaits and anticipates pain. Behind lurks the old white-bearded sheikh, gazing at the bastinade, twirling the beads of his rosary in erotic contemplation. Are the men in white, masters and disciples, all complicit in this triangulated pleasure? Two younger students, we must not forget them, are crouched in the foreground. They feign total ignorance of the bastinade, yet they are clearly aware of the consequence of misbehavior and so intently show off their own obedience and industry. The youngest of the two is diligently reading from a piece of paper, and the older one is busy burnishing his sheet of paper. One of the features that distinguishes this drawing by Muhammad Qasim is the deliberate words written out in the student's notebook. عشق میگویم و میگریم زار طفل نادانم سبق از اول. I speak love, eros, ishq, and cry endlessly. I am an ignorant child. That is the first lesson. From the very beginning, educating the rude child entails the taming of his emotions, expressed both in word and affect. It requires an etiquette of the body, an adab. The student's character is literally to be written on the soles of his feet. along with the physical punishments that were to inculcate submission and mark the body and memory of the student, reading and writing are depicted here as twin technologies through which the student is schooled in an entire new manner of comportment. I am using the term technology for its transformative power, in this case to render passionate youth into well-crafted and mannered men. Muhammad Qasim interprets the bastinada as a mimetic device to communicate unambiguously the importance of the word. Here, even within a familiar iconic illustration, the word is given a recognizable scene, its signification by publishing the message. Muhammad Qasim's subtle characterization of symmetrical and asymmetrical relationships animate for us communities of learning, communicating complicated emotional knots that bind with pain, pleasure, and humor. They give meaning to the memory of the bastinada. Let me step back for a moment to give you some historical context. What is this Ishq about? The control of key emotions of love and eros, bless you, and its associated malady of melancholy, expressed through weeping and longing for God, the beloved, takes us into the ubiquitous realm of Sufism, so integral to the daily lives of early modern Isfahanis. To be a Sufi meant that one had come under the spell of love, and love was the language expressed in verse and poetry through which intimacy was configured. Even as the ultimate purpose was to direct the Sufi disciple towards God, in fraternal communities it was to be achieved through a human guide. And so Sufism concerned itself with the disciplining of adab or etiquette, an entire set of behaviors meant to regulate the carnal body and align the self through the intermediation of the Sufi master with the celestial order. Mystical registers of adab were being translated in this period in Isfahan onto new forms of sociability, appropriating the emphasis of a spirit-body bond between lovers and beloveds, and applying it to a wide-ranging performance of urbanity in the context of friendship, coffee houses, pleasure walks, and literary salons. In 17th century Isfahan, women and men lived a good part of their lives in separate domestic spheres and social spaces. Artisans, laborers, travelers, and merchants inhabited close quarters and spent much of their time with other men at work in leisurely activity or on travels. These gendered spatial conditions reinforced intimate bonds between men and women. Such social and sexual patterns complemented the clan-like hierarchies of Isfahan's male networks, which were organized along the lines of neighborly, professional, as well as political and religious alliances. Influential Shia clerical members of the same urban community began to voice their anxiety regarding the erotic potential such relationships between men could generate, and perceived them as obstructing procreation and moral probity. Under the guise of a moral campaign that relied on decrees and ethical treatises asserting the law and rule of the Sharia, Shi'i jurists sanctioned heterosexual marriage and controlled religious and sexual practices to affect subjects whose economical and sexual production would further state interests, condemning an entire mystical way of life that permeated craft guilds, confraternities, the marketplace, as well as elite and court societies. The culture of adab gave birth to an artifact, the majmou'eh, literally a collection, that I read as fragments collected by an owner and bound in a volume, samples of which we have in thousands from Isfahan. And here is an example of a majmou'eh with different writings as well, so you know that this collection of, it could be, they vary between letters, treatises, essays, some on magic. I mean, there's just such a plethora of different kinds of literature that enters in here. And I'm reading them, and from some of the Majmua makers, we can tell when we know the owner that these are basically coming out of their libraries, and these kinds of pieces of paper that were in circulation throughout their lives that they come to record and bound at a particular time. So, along with the Majmua, single-page paintings, or Maracas, and here's one example, this from an elite context, but just to give you a sense of, again, this practice of collecting that really begins, this is a Timurid, from the Timurid courts, and moves beyond into the elite, and in the Isfahani period, already the merchant and artisanal crafts of either single-page paintings, or even here, this is for more a didactic purpose of trying to teach a painter how to design and draw a dragon, for instance, or a horse. And just the way that you see that it is put together shows you that probably students were standing around the table as they were looking at different pieces of this Maraca itself. Along with the Majmuas, we have Maracas, which indicate a parallel habit among the mercantile and artisanal class, wealthy enough to now engage in the economy of the book and the collecting of single-page illustrations, shaping tastes and aesthetics. The paintings and drawings, too, were collected in this Maraca, and it is thanks to these habits of collecting that have been passed on to us that we have these images. The Bastinada drawing of Muhammad Qasim is a product of this very shift in practices of patronage outside of court circles. It is an example of the sociological growth of poetry, prose, and painting in the early modern period in Isfahan. Together, these two artifacts tell us a story of Isfahani communities of literacy before print. The subject matter of commissioned illustrations were scenes of love and desire beyond conjugal life, figuring eros between mostly male friends, lovers, and beloveds. Consumers had a taste for the erotic, perhaps as part of an aesthetics of a sensual education for men seeking adab. Majmuas preserve a paper trail of certificates of sworn friendships, evidence of a legal status attributed to unions between two brothers and two sisters. Pledges of solidarity, siqe barodar o khohar khondegi, were penned to certify loyalty in this world and even in the afterlife, where one friend was to assure and ensure the entry of the other into paradise. Such single-hearted friendships took on the duties parents fulfilled towards their children and saints and imams towards their devout believers. Drawing on verses from the Quran, these certificates proclaim friendship to be a social institution characterized by ethical obligations, a bond with religious overtones. Sworn friendships in early modern Isfahan were also a form of voluntary kinship that enhanced social networks formed through blood and marriage ties. Friendships serve the social needs of advancement in politics and commerce through the broadening of the family network. As such, they rivaled and competed with matrimony and blood ties. This pact of friendship was ritualized through the gesture of a handshake, as memorialized in this 16th century painting by Agha Mirak from Tabriz, the former Safavi capital in northwestern Iran. Both friends use their left hand to officiate the pledge of solidarity, while as you recall in Muhammad Qasim's Bastinada, it was the right hand of the master that struck difference in rank. In this painting, both men are courtiers, wearing the headgear of the Safavi Brotherhood. One is most likely a soldier, for he wears his profession on his belt. It is he who holds the gift of a book of poetry, or perhaps the text of the Oath of Friendship. In the 17th century, these affective bonds between men that articulate symmetries came under close surveillance and regulations with the culture of adab in Isfahan. These 3 folios were collected in an album signed by the calligrapher Mir Ali in Bukhara around 1520 and 1550. They exhibit the relationship between the writing of a page of mystical poetry, the paper itself, and here the context in which poetry was circulated and exchanged between 2 men. The page of love poetry is compiled in the form of a jung or safine, the Arabic term for boat, or in the Chinese term jung for boat as well. The shape is these long, thin, as you see in this thing, narrow folios that are bound together, and oftentimes we still have them in manuscript libraries. They do survive, and oftentimes in miniatures you see them, people writing down little lines of poetry as they're traveling and putting them in their belt. It's a portable book that's easy to take along with them. The page of love poetry, okay, the shape of the portable book often sized in this narrow format so that the traveler, recorder of anthologies of poetry, could tuck it into his belt comfortably. The image on the right depicts one male figure holding such a book of poetry that initiates intimacy between the 2. The hand gesture of the male figure on the left signals his receiving a book of poetry from his companion. It is not until we read the poem on the top right-hand side of the image that the meaning of the exchange becomes clear. The lines of poetry read, دو یار زیرک از باده کهن دوستی فراقی و کتابی و گوشه چمنی. 2 clever friends drinking from the aged jug of friendship, a delightful moment, a book, and a secluded grassy spot. This image brings to mind the ritual performance of friendship. It is in a secluded space, complete with the accoutrements of mystical union, a garden in full bloom, a book of poetry, a jug and cup of wine, which you couldn't do without, through which 2 fast friends experience the pleasures of intimacy and conversation. With the calligraphy on the bottom of the page, the value and significance of paper is announced explicitly. کاغذی بهتر از خطایی نیست، لیک چندان که آزمایی نیست. There is no paper better than the Chinese. No matter what you may sample, there is no better. Sounds like a modern advertisement. Paper is the technology through which friendships were cultivated, the very medium through which intersubjective discursive practices between friends are made possible. And here it's clear that, again, these gestures that are very symbolic but also very recognizable by now, the one beloved holding the book of poetry, and here the forlorn, actually the lover and the beloved, crying, probably weeping, holding a handkerchief in hand. And again, whether this is the paper that is exchanged between them, a distance that's created, but a distance that's broken certainly through the paper and the medium of paper itself. Majmu'as from the 17th century preserve a new medium of communication. Friendship letters surface in these literary anthologies as a distinct type of correspondence, copied, collected, and transmitted over several generations in Isfahan. 17th century scribes, authors, and owners of majmu'as categorized this epistolary genre as the rasail ikhwaniyat, or fraternal letters. Fraternal letters are model letters of friendship that performed a set of conventions and protocols resembling the practice that governed sworn friendships between male members of craft circles and of mystical communities who were in spirit married and had become brothers to one another. Earlier expressions of male friendship in the 16th century, once verbalized through ghazal, love poetry, began in the 17th century to be performed in the prose form of fraternal letters. But unlike letters, ghazals were mostly shared orally. The epistolary expressions retain features of the ghazal, and it's quite uncanny how there is that translation from the ghazal poetry from verse to prose in the letters, particularly drawing on the prominent image of the absent friend, central to the mystical trope of separation from the beloved. Many of the letters deploying this image of the longing lover, as well as the homoerotic accent of ghazal poetry, widely used and circulated among friends, were also present in these letters. And I think we have to pause for a moment just to think about how different letter writing as a medium was for people who were used to have this kind of oral communication with one another, and how that kind of absence, begins to and needs to be really filled in the body itself of the letter. Reflecting anxieties around the vicissitudes of friendship in early modern Isfahan, modern letters contained requests to meet with friends, chides of negligence and forgiveness for disloyal behavior. So clearly, friendship doesn't always work. And there are definitely these kinds of letters to signal moments of time where friendship turns ugly, rather than friendship actually works and is inclusive and in fact is exclusive. In personal letters, one is impressed by the author's self-conscious epistolary voice in the absence of his friend's body. Currently, I'm reading majmuas of familiar letters to determine how both the absent and missing body, as well as this face-to-face encounter, becomes represented in a disembodied letter. Familiar letters textualize and texturize gazes and the loving emotions that they emanated. They mobilize the poetic language of the ghazal to conjure the beloved, evoking, for example, the absent one's braid, the arrow-shaped eyebrows, or black facial mole. Epistolary representations of these letters were stylized performances of emotions meant as ciphers for particular kinds of desires restricted by the new civilizing code of conduct. The 17th century culture of epistolarity in Isfahan allows the historian entry into the social elite's dynamic of knowledge and affect, where speech, gestures, and gazes were written into the letter, and where the oral and the written fused to shape an alternative mode of communication and form of expressing the emergent self. Traces of the complex contemporaneous meanings of intimacy reside in familiar letters, whose location I have just begun to develop for you here at the intersection of histories of friendship, literacy, and collecting. Let me end with an image of a male reading a letter or a portrait. It's not quite clear. There's no writing that's very clearly delineated by the painter. From his beloved, painted on a cushion. Art historians have associated the painting with a stylistic innovation of Afzal Hosseini, who paints around 1640, 1650 in Isfahan. The topos of including the image of the beloved on a cushion or a wine bottle had been introduced a decade earlier by a famous painter, Reza Abbasi. And there are several examples that Sheila Camby, who's the current curator at the Met, has studied in her book, The Rebellious Reformer. Given the civilizational project I've outlined for you here, the popularity of depicting a singular friend reading a poem or a letter, at times accompanied by the image of his beloved on the cushion, rather than two friends in conversation or exchanging a handshake, speaks of a social transformation in the practice of friendship, or at least that's how I'm reading it. In the absence of the beloved friend, reading, conversing with the beloved, reciting poetry together is by the mid-17th century represented as a solitary act. The disciplining project of adab here has affected an entire manner of comportment to render passionate friends into well-crafted men, at least idealistically. The early modernity of Isfahan, then I argue, must be understood not only as the history of a changing nature of the state and its control of literacy, but also of the changing nature of the literate and prosaic self and friend. In thinking about the lines of force between collecting, self-creation, and friendship and community, we should consider the model of the self, a model of psychology current among these painters, poets, and collectors. The Aristotelian legacy of the mimetic imagination flowed into Persian pedagogies of learning through medieval philosophers like Ibn Sina and Nasruddin Tusi. This opens up a number of ways of thinking about the collecting self, that hence this weird composition that you saw in the title, The Collecting Self. It is not inevitable that people, that I don't know how else to really talk about them, I don't like to talk about them as fragmentary selves, but I'm really open to hearing your suggestions. It is not inevitable that people should imagine themselves as collectors. Few world traditions think that way. But it is after Aristotle insists that the mind is made up of a collection of forms, that everything that we know is derived ultimately from sensory evidence. It is mostly in the Aristotelian tradition that people collect things, imagining commonplacing as a kind of self-invention. True, it's a weird way of thinking of creating oneself. It requires that we already think of memory as something external, external to a little internal self that is free to dip into the library of its mind or not, as it sees fit. It means that teaching and remembering has to do with filling one's mind with objects that really happens, or teaching that happens through this familiarity with what came before. In other words, teaching is done through collections, through majmu'as, through Maracas, through divans, through safinas, just as communities are built in sharing this repertoire of images. In Muhammad Qasem's drawing, I read his interpretation of the bastinada as furthering a body of knowledge on the pedagogy of punishment, creating his memory of that embodied experience, infused with pain, lust, and humor. In the case of Afzal Hosseini, he is fashioning, or maybe reinscribing, a new kind of affective and aesthetic experience of friendship, where the Aristotelian concept of takhil, or image evocation, is mobilized to particularize his poetics of friendship, in tune with the mannerisms of the culture of adab. The male figure in the cushion holds a handkerchief, a symbol of the absent, lamenting beloved. Tactility is painted into the image as the beloved touches the lover's belt, who in turn caresses the image, poem, or letter on his lap with his fingers, his gaze, and in fact his entire body. The poetics of love and mimesis that a century earlier was to be communicated between two friends or lovers on a secluded grassy spot, now, with the absence of the friend, practiced in the adab of letter writing, the image evoked through the medium of paper, not produced in China, but in Isfahan, an emotional reaction where gestures and gazes are drawn in as ciphers for forbidden desires. We do not know who commissioned this portrait of Afzal Hosseini. It is possible, however, that at this initial phase of writing fraternal letters, such an image, or such images, which we have many of, were sent along with a letter to the friend, a mimetic again device that simultaneously filled the absence of the beloved and acted as a pedagogical tool for adab. I began and ended with my little exploration into didacticism, literacy, and collecting with two paintings whose pictorial surfaces faded out in my narrative into things and practices. And I hope that my turning of friendship really into a heuristic has shown you how friendship, connected people to things, to text, and to images to shape communities of literacy and collecting selves. Thank you.